Sometimes a single moment can change everything you thought you knew about yourself. In 1877, when 60-year-old cowboy Jed Cole looked into the eyes of a caged grizzly bear at a dusty auction, he saw something that would haunt him forever. Not wildness, but a desperate plea for mercy. The locals called the massive creature a man-killer, destined for sport or spectacle. But Jed saw the strange mark on its paw, the unusual stillness in its massive frame. Against all reason, he spent his last silver dollars to buy the bear's freedom. What he discovered next would challenge everything he believed about civilization and wildness. What was the mysterious truth about this bear that would change both their lives forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust of Deadwood Gulch settled into every crease of Jedediah Cole's weathered face as he guided his old mare, Bess, down the main thoroughfare. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the ramshackle buildings, and the air carried the familiar scent of pine, horse sweat, and the lingering smoke from the blacksmith's forge. At 60 years old, Jed had seen more boomtowns rise and fall than most men had fingers to count on, but Deadwood Gulch felt different somehow, tired, like an old man ready to give up the ghost. Bess snorted and shook her graying mane as they passed Murphy's saloon, where the sound of off-key piano music drifted through the batwing doors. Jed patted her neck gently, understanding her weariness. They'd been riding together for the better part of 15 years, and she'd carried him through more scrapes and chases than either of them cared to remember. The worn leather of his bounty hunter's badge, tucked deep in his vest pocket, pressed against his ribs with each of Bess's steps, a reminder of a life that had grown heavier with each passing season. The badge had once meant something: purpose, direction, a way to make sense of the chaos that seemed to follow men wherever they gathered in these wild territories. But after 30 years of tracking down killers, thieves, and desperados, Jed found himself questioning what justice really meant. Too many of the men he'd brought in had been driven to desperation by circumstances beyond their control. Too many. Families left behind to wonder if their father, brother, or son might have been different if the world had offered them a gentler hand. As he rounded the corner near the Mercantile, Jed noticed the unusual bustle of activity near the edge of town. Colorful wagons were arranged in a rough circle, and several men in worn traveling clothes were loading equipment with the practiced efficiency of folks who'd done this dance 100 times before. A traveling circus by the look of it, though, one that had seen better days. The paint on the wagon sides was faded and chipped, and the canvas stretched over wooden frames bore patches in 3 different shades of brown. "Ho there, stranger," called out a voice from behind him. Jed turned to see Tom Hastings, the town's general store owner, approaching with his characteristic quick stride. Tom was a thin man with nervous energy, always ready with the latest gossip, or a strong opinion about matters that were none of his business. "You here for the auction?" "What auction would that be, Tom?" Jed asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. In towns like Deadwood Gulch, when a traveling show went bust, everything that couldn't walk away on its own ended up on the auction block. Tom's eyes lit up with the particular gleam of a man who enjoyed being the bearer of news. "Circus folks are selling off everything they can't afford to feed or transport. Got themselves a regular menagerie, they do. Couple of horses, some trick ponies, and—" he lowered his voice conspiratorially— "one hell of a big grizzly bear." Jed felt something cold settle in his stomach. Bears in captivity never fared well, especially not the big ones. "Bear, you say? Mean as a rattlesnake? According to the circus master, killed a man in Colorado Springs just last month, or so they claim. They're looking to sell him to whoever's got the stomach and the coin for such a beast." Tom shook his head with the practiced disapproval of a man who'd never faced anything more dangerous than an angry customer. "Can't imagine what sort of fool would want to buy himself that kind of trouble." Jed nodded slowly, his attention already drifting toward the circus camp. Something about the situation sat wrong with him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. In his experience, truly dangerous animals didn't usually travel with circuses for long. They either had to be put down or they broke free and ended the problem themselves. For a bear to survive in captivity long enough to be sold at auction suggested either exceptional restraint or exceptional circumstances. "Appreciate the information, Tom," Jed said, touching the brim of his hat. "Think I'll wander over and take a look for myself." As he guided Bess toward the circus camp, Jed couldn't shake the memory of the last time he'd encountered a captive bear. It had been nearly 20 years ago, up in Montana Territory, where he'd been tracking a horse thief named Danny Morse. The trail had led him to a small trading post where a fur trapper named Gus Henley kept a young black bear chained to a post, forcing it to dance for the entertainment of travelers willing to part with a few coins. The bear had been thin, its coat dull and patchy, its eyes holding the particular deadness that came from having the spirit slowly crushed out of you. Jed had watched for maybe 5 minutes before the sight became more than he could stomach. He'd paid Gus $20, more than the man probably made in a month, for the bear's freedom, then spent another hour cutting through the heavy chain that had rubbed raw wounds around the creature's neck. The bear had looked at him for a long moment after gaining its freedom, as if trying to understand this sudden change in fortune. Then it had simply walked away, disappearing into the forest without looking back. Jed never knew if the bear survived in the wild after so long in captivity, but he'd slept better for months afterward, just knowing he'd given it the chance to try. The circus camp buzzed with activity as handlers moved between the wagons, loading and securing equipment with the weary efficiency of people who were used to breaking camp in a hurry. Near the center of the circle, Jed could see a large iron cage mounted on a sturdy wagon, its bars thick and closely spaced. Even from a distance, he could make out the massive form inside, though the bear remained perfectly still. "You interested in the auction, mister?" A voice interrupted his observations. Jed turned to see a small, wiry man with graying whiskers and eyes that held the particular sharpness of someone accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. The man's clothes were better than those of the common laborers, marking him as someone with authority in the operation. "Just curious," Jed replied. "Name's Cole. Jedediah Cole." The man extended a calloused hand. "Marcus Fleming. I run this outfit, or what's left of it." His grip was firm but brief, the handshake of a man with too much on his mind for extended pleasantries. "You look like someone who's seen his share of the frontier. You wouldn't happen to be interested in a trained bear, would you?" Jed studied Fleming's face, noting the tension around his eyes and the way his gaze kept darting back toward the caged animal. "Trained for what?" "Oh, all sorts of things. Wrestling, dancing, standing on his hind legs. Real crowd-pleaser, he is." Fleming's voice carried the practiced enthusiasm of a showman, but underneath it, Jed detected something that sounded almost like relief. "Course, he's gotten a bit temperamental in his old age. Needs someone with experience handling large animals." "Temperamental how?" Fleming's expression shifted slightly, and for a moment the showman's mask slipped. "He's stopped performing. Won't eat properly, just sits there, quiet as you please. Been that way for weeks now." He lowered his voice. "Between you and me, mister, I think the old boy's just tired. Been with us for near on 8 years, and I suspect he's ready for a change of scenery." Something in Fleming's tone suggested there was more to the story. But before Jed could ask any follow-up questions, a commotion near the bear's cage drew both men's attention. A small crowd had gathered, and among them, Jed recognized several. Local men known for their love of gambling and questionable entertainment. "Let's go have a look," Fleming said, though his voice lacked enthusiasm. As they approached the cage, Jed got his first clear view of the bear. The animal was indeed massive, probably weighing close to 600 pounds, with dark brown fur that showed silver around the muzzle. But what struck Jed most was the bear's posture. Instead of pacing or showing the restless agitation common, To caged animals, it sat with an almost human dignity, its dark eyes focused on something beyond the gathered crowd. "Big son of a gun, ain't he?" said Pete Crowley, a local rancher known for his quick temper and quicker fists. "Bet he'd make quite a show in a fighting pit." Jed felt his jaw tighten. Bear baiting was illegal in most territories, but that didn't stop men like Crowley from organizing such events in remote locations where the law's reach was limited. The thought of this magnificent animal being tormented for the entertainment of drunken spectators made his stomach turn. "Now, Mr. Crowley," Fleming said quickly, "I should mention that this particular bear has never been used for fighting. He's a performer, not a fighter." Crowley laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Hell, Fleming, any bear can be taught to fight if you motivate him properly. Ain't that right, boys?" The men around him chuckled and nodded, and Jed noticed Fleming's face grow pale. It was clear the circus master was hoping for a different sort of buyer, but in a town like Deadwood Gulch, options were limited. Jed stepped closer to the cage, studying the bear more carefully. The animal's coat was in good condition, its eyes clear and alert, suggesting it had been well cared for despite its current circumstances. But as he watched, the bear turned its massive head slightly, and their eyes met through the iron bars. What Jed saw in that gaze stopped him cold. There was intelligence there, certainly, but also something else. A sadness so profound it seemed, almost human. The bear held his stare for several long seconds, and in that moment, Jed felt a recognition pass between them, as if the animal was trying to communicate something important. Then he noticed the mark on the bear's right front paw, a distinctive white patch in the shape of a crescent moon, clearly visible against the dark fur. Something about that marking tugged at the edges of his memory, though he couldn't quite place why it seemed familiar. "What's the starting bid?" Jed heard himself ask, surprising both Fleming and himself. Fleming's eyebrows rose. "Well, I was hoping to get at least $50 for him, considering his size and training." $50. It was almost everything Jed had left to his name, the remainder of his savings after 30 years of bounty hunting. Common sense told him to walk away, to save his money for his retirement, to let someone else worry about the fate of one bear in a world full of injustices he couldn't fix. But as he looked into those intelligent, pleading eyes, Jed found his hand moving toward his vest pocket where his remaining silver dollars rested. Something deep in his chest told him that this moment mattered, that some choices defined a man more than all the others combined. The auction was set to begin at sunset, Fleming explained, giving interested parties time to examine the various animals and equipment. Jed nodded absently, his attention still focused on the bear, trying to understand why this particular animal had affected him so deeply. As the crowd dispersed and the afternoon shadows lengthened, Jed remained near the cage, quietly observing. The bear, for its part, seemed equally interested in him, occasionally turning its massive head to meet his gaze with what could only be described as hope. The sun hung low over Deadwood Gulch as Marcus Fleming climbed atop a wooden crate that served as his makeshift auctioneer's platform. A crowd of perhaps 30 townspeople had gathered in the dusty clearing, drawn by curiosity and the promise of unusual entertainment. Jed remained near the back, his weathered hands resting on Bess's reins as he watched the proceedings with growing unease. Fleming began with the smaller items, props, costumes, and equipment that had once brought wonder to children in a dozen frontier towns. A painted wooden elephant head went for $2 to the local schoolteacher, who claimed she could use it for educational purposes. A collection of juggling pins sold for 50 cents to a saloon keeper who thought they might amuse his customers. On slow nights, as each item found a new owner, Jed noticed how Fleming's voice grew more subdued, as if he were saying goodbye to old friends rather than conducting business. The circus master's eyes kept drifting toward the bear's cage, where the massive animal continued its patient vigil, watching the crowd with those uncommonly intelligent eyes. "Now then," Fleming announced, his voice carrying across the gathering. Dusk, We come to our final item of the evening. This here grizzly bear, 8 years old and standing near 7 feet tall. He's been trained for performance, knows several commands, and has traveled with our company for the better part of his life. Pete Crowley pushed his way closer to the front of the crowd, his face flushed with whiskey and anticipation. What about that story of him killing a man in Colorado Springs? That true? Fleming's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. There was an incident in Colorado Springs, yes. A drunk cowhand got too close to the cage and stuck his arm through the bars, despite repeated warnings. The bear defended himself, as any wild animal would. He paused, meeting Crowley's gaze directly. The man survived, though he lost the use of 2 fingers. Hardly the work of a man-killer. A murmur ran through the crowd as people processed this information. Jed could see the disappointment on Crowley's face. Clearly, he'd been hoping for a more dramatic story to justify whatever plans he had for the animal. Starting bid is $50, Fleming continued. Do I hear 50? For a moment, silence stretched across the gathering. $50 was a considerable sum in a town where most men worked for $1 a day. Jed's hand moved unconsciously to his vest pocket, where the weight of his remaining silver dollars seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. $40, called out a voice from the middle of the crowd. Jed turned to see Harold Whitman, a local rancher who specialized in training horses for the cavalry. Whitman was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy, which made his interest in the bear somewhat surprising. 45, countered another voice. This time it was Doc Morrison, the town's physician, though Jed couldn't fathom what use a doctor would have for a grizzly bear. Crowley's voice cut through the growing excitement. $55, and I guarantee this beast will provide entertainment for years to come. The way Crowley emphasized entertainment made Jed's blood run cold. He'd seen men like Crowley before, men who found pleasure in the suffering of creatures that couldn't fight back on equal terms. The thought of this dignified bear being tormented for the amusement of drunken gamblers was more than Jed could stomach. $60, Jed called out, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd despite his position at the back. Heads turned in his direction, and he could see the surprise on many faces. Jed Cole was known as a solitary man, someone who kept to himself and avoided unnecessary complications. His sudden interest in acquiring a grizzly bear struck many as completely out of character. Crowley's face darkened as he realized he was facing serious competition. 65, he shot back immediately. Jed felt his heart pounding as he calculated his remaining funds. He had exactly $73 to his name, his entire life savings after 3 decades of dangerous work. To spend nearly all of it on a bear seemed like the action of a madman, but something deeper than logic was driving his decisions now. 70, Jed said quietly, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. A hushed murmur rippled through the crowd. $70 was more money than many of these people saw in months. Crowley's face had gone red with frustration, and Jed could see him calculating whether his desire for the bear was worth matching such a substantial bid. 75, Crowley snarled, his voice tight with anger. Jed closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. $75 would leave him with only enough money for basic supplies, certainly not enough to sustain him through the coming winter. It was financial suicide, pure and simple. But when he opened his eyes and looked toward the cage, he found the bear watching him with those impossibly expressive eyes. In that gaze, Jed saw something that reminded him of himself in his darker moments. A creature that had given up hope, but was desperately trying to believe that redemption might still be possible. $75, Fleming called out, scanning the crowd. Do I hear 80? The silence stretched long enough that several people began to shift uncomfortably. Jed's mouth felt dry as dust as he prepared to speak the words that would change everything. $80, he said, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying to every corner of the gathering. The crowd fell completely silent. Even Crowley seemed stunned by the escalation. $80 was serious money, the kind of sum that represented months of careful saving for most working men. Fleming looked toward Crowley expectantly, but the rancher was shaking his head slowly, his face twisted with frustration and disbelief. "That's too rich for my blood," he muttered, stepping back from the crowd. "Crazy old fool can have his bear." $80 going once," Fleming announced, his voice carrying a note of relief that didn't go unnoticed by Jed. "Going twice." He paused, scanning the crowd one final time. "Sold to Mr. Cole for $80. The crowd began to disperse immediately, most people shaking their heads in amazement at what they'd just witnessed. Jed approached the makeshift platform on unsteady legs, pulling the silver dollars from his pocket with hands that trembled slightly. As he counted out the money into Fleming's waiting palm, he caught the circus master studying his face with curiosity. "Mind if I ask what you plan to do with him?" Fleming said quietly as he tucked the money into his own vest pocket. Jed looked toward the cage, where his new responsibility waited with patient dignity. "Honestly, I have no earthly idea." Fleming smiled for the first time that evening. "You?" "No, Mr. Cole. I've been in this business for 23 years, and I've learned to read people pretty well. I think you might be exactly what old Bruno has been waiting for." "Bruno?" That's what we called him. Never seemed to fit quite right. But circus names rarely do. Fleming gestured toward the bear. His real name, the one the Indians used when he was young, was something like Quiet Thunder. At least that's what the trapper who sold him to us claimed. Something cold ran down Jed's spine. "Indians?" "Oh, yes. Bruno, there wasn't born in captivity. He was raised by a Lakota band up in the Black Hills, treated more like a member of the tribe than a pet. The trapper said they considered him some sort of guardian spirit." Fleming's expression grew thoughtful. "Story goes that when the army forced the tribe onto the reservation, they had to leave Bruno behind. The trapper found him weeks later, just sitting by their old campsite, waiting for them to come back." Jed stared at the bear with new understanding. The crescent-shaped marking on its paw, the unusual intelligence in its eyes, the dignified way it carried itself despite its circumstances. Suddenly, everything made sense. This wasn't just any bear. This was a creature that had been loved, had belonged somewhere, and had lost everything through no fault of its own. "Why didn't you tell the crowd this story?" Jed asked. Fleming's smile was sad, but genuine. "Because men like Crowley don't care about stories like that. They only see dollar signs and entertainment value. But you," he studied Jed's weathered face, "you look like someone who understands what it means to lose everything and keep going anyway." As the last of the crowd wandered away toward the saloons and their evening meals, Jed found himself alone with Fleming and his newly acquired responsibility. The bear, Bruno, or Quiet Thunder, or whatever his true name might be, watched him through the iron bars with eyes that seemed to hold decades of accumulated wisdom and sorrow. "The cage comes with the purchase," Fleming said, "though I suspect you'll want to figure out some other arrangement before long. Bruno's been patient with confinement, but I don't think he'll tolerate it much longer." Jed nodded absently, his mind racing as he tried to process the full magnitude of what he'd just done. He'd spent nearly every dollar he owned on a creature he knew nothing about caring for, based on nothing more than a moment of emotional connection and a half-remembered story about guardian spirits. Any reasonable man would call it the height of foolishness. But as Jed looked into those intelligent brown eyes, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. Whatever happened next, he'd given this magnificent creature a chance at something better than a fighting pit or a life of forced entertainment. The silver dollars were gone, his financial security evaporated in a single impulsive decision. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jedediah Cole felt like he'd done something that truly mattered. The iron collar around the bear's massive neck caught the first light of dawn as Jed approached the cage with a bucket of water and what food he'd been able to scrape together. He'd spent a sleepless night camped beside the wagon, listening to the soft sounds of the bear's breathing and trying to figure out what in the hell he was supposed to do now. Fleming and his remaining crew had departed before sunrise, leaving behind only a brief set of instructions about feeding schedules and a warning to be careful of the bear's reach when cleaning the cage. "He's gentle enough," Fleming had said, "but he's still a wild animal at heart. Don't forget that." Now, in the pale morning light, Jed found himself studying the heavy iron collar that encircled the bear's neck like a symbol of everything wrong with civilization. The metal had rubbed patches of fur away, leaving raw spots that spoke of years of patient endurance. Thick chains connected the collar to iron rings bolted to the cage floor, allowing the bear just enough movement to stand and turn around, but nothing approaching real freedom. "Morning, Bruno," Jed said quietly, setting the water bucket just outside the cage bars. The bear's ears pricked forward at the sound of his voice, and those intelligent dark eyes focused on him with what seemed like hopeful attention. The bear, Jed found himself thinking of him as Quiet Thunder now, the name somehow fitting better. Then the circus moniker shifted slightly, the chains making a soft clinking sound against the iron floor. He didn't rush toward the water as Jed had expected. Instead he waited, watching as if asking permission. "Go ahead, big fellow," Jed murmured. "It's yours." Only then did Quiet Thunder move toward the bucket, his movements careful and deliberate despite the obvious thirst. He drank slowly, methodically, pausing occasionally to look up at Jed as if making sure his new owner approved of his actions. The level of consideration and intelligence in those simple movements struck Jed profoundly. This wasn't the behavior of a mindless beast driven by basic instincts. This was a creature that had learned to read human moods and expectations, one that had been taught to consider the feelings of others before taking care of his own needs. "Jesus," Jed whispered, understanding dawning on him. "What did they do to you?" As if in response to his words, Quiet Thunder lifted his massive head and made a soft chuffing sound, not quite a growl, not quite a sigh, but something that seemed to carry the weight of years of accumulated sadness. Jed spent the morning observing and trying to understand the routine that had been Quiet Thunder's life for the past 8 years. The bear had clearly been trained to remain quiet and still for long periods, to eat only when given permission, and to perform simple commands on cue. But underneath that learned behavior, Jed caught glimpses of something else, a spark of wild dignity that hadn't been completely extinguished by years of captivity. When Tom Hastings arrived at mid-morning with his usual load of gossip and unwanted advice, he found Jed sitting on a wooden crate beside the cage, sharing his breakfast jerky with the bear through the bars. "Morning, Jed," Tom called out, his voice carrying a note of nervous excitement. "Whole town's talking about your purchase last night. Folks are wondering what you plan to do with that beast." Jed looked up from feeding Quiet Thunder small pieces of dried meat. "Haven't decided yet, Tom. Still getting acquainted." Tom stepped closer, his eyes wide, as he watched the massive bear gently take food from Jed's fingers. "Ain't you worried he'll take your hand off? That's a lot of teeth and claws you're dealing with there." "He's been careful so far," Jed replied, offering another piece of jerky. Quiet Thunder's massive jaws could have easily crushed Jed's entire forearm, but the bear took the food with the delicacy of a gentleman accepting tea cakes at a church social. "Well, I've got to say, he seems a lot calmer than I expected," Tom admitted. "Course, Pete Crowley's telling everyone who'll listen that you're a damn fool for spending good money on a worthless animal. Says you'll come to your senses soon enough and put him down or sell him for bear grease." Jed felt his jaw tighten. "Pete Crowley's entitled to his opinion." "There's something else, though," Tom continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Doc Morrison stopped by the store this morning, asking questions about bear anatomy. Seems he's got some scientific interest in studying a live specimen up close. Offered to buy the bear from you for $100. The offer should have been tempting, $20 more than Jed had paid, enough to restore his financial security and then some. But the thought of Quiet Thunder being subjected to medical experimentation made his stomach turn. "Tell Doc Morrison I appreciate his interest, but the bear's not for sale." Tom's eyebrows rose. "Not for sale? Jed, that's a $20 profit for one night's ownership. Seems like easy money to me." "Nothing about this situation is easy, Tom." Jed stood up, brushing crumbs from his pants. "And some things shouldn't be measured purely in dollars." After Tom departed, shaking his head in confusion, Jed turned his attention back to Quiet Thunder. The bear had finished eating and was now sitting in what Jed was beginning to recognize as his characteristic pose. Upright, dignified, watching the world with patient eyes that seemed to see far more than they should. "What am I supposed to do with you?" Jed asked aloud, more to himself than to the bear. "Can't keep you in this cage forever, can't turn you loose in town, can't afford to feed you much longer on what I've got left." Quiet Thunder tilted his massive head slightly, as if considering the question seriously. Then he made that soft, chuffing sound again, and gestured with one enormous paw toward the heavy chains that bound him to the cage floor. The meaning was unmistakable. Freedom. That's what he wanted. Not just release from the cage, but liberation. From the iron collar and chains that had defined his existence for so many years. Jed knelt down beside the cage and examined the locking mechanism that secured the collar. It was a simple but sturdy design, requiring a specific key that Fleming had left behind along with his other instructions. The lock was well maintained, suggesting that the collar was removed periodically, probably for cleaning or medical examinations. "You want out of those chains, don't you, big fellow?" Quiet Thunder's response was immediate and unmistakable. He moved closer to the bars, lowering his head so that the collar was easily accessible, then waited with the patience of a creature that had learned not to expect immediate gratification, but hadn't given up hope entirely. Jed retrieved the key from his saddlebags and returned to the cage. His hands shook slightly as he inserted the key into the lock. This was it, the moment when his impulsive purchase would either prove to be inspired or catastrophically foolish. The lock clicked open with a soft metallic sound that seemed to echo in the morning air. Jed carefully lifted the heavy iron collar away from Quiet Thunder's neck, revealing the raw, hairless patches where the metal had rubbed against fur and skin for years. For a moment, neither man nor bear moved. Then Quiet Thunder lifted his massive head, rolling his neck muscles for the first time in longer than Jed could imagine. The bear's eyes closed briefly, as if savoring the simple pleasure of being able to move freely. When Quiet Thunder opened his eyes again, he looked directly at Jed with an expression that was unmistakably grateful. Not the gratitude of a dumb animal receiving food or shelter, but the complex appreciation of one thinking being acknowledging a kindness from another. "There," Jed said softly. "That's got to feel better." But even as he spoke, Jed realized that removing the collar had only created a new set of problems. Quiet Thunder was still confined to the cage, still dependent on human care for food and water, still trapped in a situation that was fundamentally unnatural for a creature of his size and intelligence. The bear seemed to understand this as well. He moved to the cage door and pressed his nose against the iron bars, looking out at the vast landscape beyond Deadwood Gulch, with an expression of longing so profound it was almost painful to witness. Jed found himself thinking about Fleming's story of the Lakota tribe that had raised Quiet Thunder, of how the bear had waited at their abandoned campsite for his family to return. Here was a creature that understood loyalty, loss, and hope in ways that many humans never managed to grasp. "I don't know how to fix this," Jed admitted, placing his hand against the cage bars near where Quiet Thunder's massive paw rested. "But I promise you this, whatever happens next, you won't end up in a fighting pit or a laboratory. That much I can guarantee." The bear looked at him for a long moment, then gently touched his nose to Jed's outstretched fingers through the bars. It was a gesture of trust so simple and profound that it brought unexpected tears to the old cowboy's eyes. As the morning wore on, and more townspeople came by to gawk at the unusual sight of Jedediah Cole caring for a circus bear, Jed found himself making a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. He was going to find a way to give Quiet Thunder real freedom, even if it meant leaving Deadwood Gulch forever. The bear had waited 8 years for someone to understand what he truly needed. Jed wasn't about to let him wait any longer. By the third day, Jed had developed a routine that felt almost natural. He rose before dawn to tend to Quiet Thunder's needs, spent the morning hours observing the bear's behavior and trying to understand his unspoken communications, and used the afternoons to plan for a future that remained frustratingly unclear. The bear had taken to greeting him each morning with a soft, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a purr, but conveyed unmistakable pleasure at his arrival. More remarkably, Quiet Thunder had begun responding to his voice with subtle changes in posture and expression, as if he were learning to read the nuances of Jed's moods and intentions. On this particular morning, Jed noticed something that made him pause in his usual routine. Quiet Thunder had arranged the straw bedding in his cage into a careful pattern, a rough circle with a smaller mound in the center. It looked almost like, "Well, I'll be damned," Jed murmured, recognizing the formation. It was a traditional, native medicine wheel, the kind used in ceremonial gatherings and spiritual observances. He'd seen similar arrangements during his years tracking outlaws through Lakota territory, though he'd never paid them much attention at the time. The fact that Quiet Thunder remembered such things after 8 years of circus life spoke to the depth of his early experiences with the tribe that had raised him. More importantly, it suggested that the bear was trying to communicate something specific about his heritage and needs. Jed was still contemplating this discovery when Sheriff Dan Carver arrived, his expression grim and his hand resting casually on the butt of his Colt Peacemaker. "Morning, Jed," Carver said, though his tone suggested the morning was anything but good. "We need to have a talk." "About what, Dan?" "About that bear of yours." Carver gestured toward the cage where Quiet Thunder sat watching them with alert attention. "Got complaints from several townspeople. Seems some folks are concerned about having a dangerous wild animal so close to the residential area." Jed felt his temper beginning to rise. "Dangerous? He's been nothing but gentle since I bought him. Haven't heard so much as a growl out of him." "That may be, but the law's the law. Territory statute requires wild animals to be kept at least a mile outside any incorporated township. Deadwood Gulch might not be much, but we are officially incorporated as of last month." This was news to Jed, and from Carver's uncomfortable expression, it was clear the sheriff wished he didn't have to be the one delivering it. The two men had known each other for years, had shared drinks and poker games at Murphy's saloon, and Carver generally took a live-and-let-live approach to law enforcement. "How long do I have?" Jed asked. "Town council's giving you a week to find alternative arrangements. After that, I'll have to confiscate the animal as a public nuisance." Carver's voice dropped. "Between you and me, Jed, Pete Crowley's been stirring up sentiment against you. Got people scared that Bear's going to break loose and eat their children. And what does Pete suggest I do with him?" Carver's uncomfortable silence was answer enough. Pete Crowley's solution would undoubtedly involve a rifle and a shallow grave, disposing of the problem in the most direct way possible. After the sheriff departed, Jed sat heavily on his wooden crate and tried to process this new complication. A week wasn't nearly enough time to arrange proper care for a creature like Quiet Thunder, especially not with his limited resources. Most zoos or menageries were located in large cities hundreds of miles away, and the cost of transportation alone would be prohibitive. "Looks like we're running out of options, old fellow," Jed said aloud. Quiet Thunder's response surprised him. The bear rose to his full height, nearly 7 feet of muscle and fur, and moved to the back corner of the cage. There he began digging through the straw bedding with deliberate purpose, as if searching for something specific. After several minutes of careful excavation, Quiet Thunder's claws found what he was looking for. He lifted a small object and carried it to the front of the cage, placing it carefully on the floor where Jed could see it clearly. It was a piece of carved bone, no bigger than a man's thumb, decorated with intricate symbols that had been etched. With loving care, the yellowed surface showed evidence of years of handling, and the craftsmanship was unmistakably native in origin. "Where did you get this?" Jed asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Quiet Thunder touched the bone carving gently with one massive claw, then looked at Jed with eyes that held depths of memory and longing. The meaning was clear. This was a keepsake from his time with the Lakota band that had raised him, something he'd managed to keep hidden throughout his years of captivity. Jed picked up the carved bone and examined it more closely. The symbols were unlike anything he'd seen before, but they clearly held significance for the bear. One marking in particular caught his attention. A crescent moon, similar to the white patch on Quiet Thunder's paw, surrounded by what looked like stylized thunderclouds. "Quiet Thunder," Jed said softly, understanding flooding through him. "That's not just what they called you, is it? It's who you are." The bear's soft chuff of agreement sent a chill down Jed's spine. This wasn't simply a matter of giving an animal its freedom. This was about reuniting a spiritual being with his rightful place in the world, returning something sacred to where it belonged. But that realization only made the situation more complicated. The Lakota bands that had once roamed freely through the Black Hills were now confined to reservations hundreds of miles away, their traditional ways of life systematically destroyed by government policy and military force. Even if Jed could locate the specific tribe that had raised Quiet Thunder, there was no guarantee they would be able or willing to take him back. Still, he had to try. The alternative, watching this magnificent creature waste away in captivity, or worse, seeing him destroyed by fearful townspeople, was unthinkable. That afternoon, Jed made his way to the trading post on the outskirts of town, where old Bill Hawkins kept a small collection of books and maps gathered from travelers over the years. If he was going to find Quiet Thunder's original family, he needed to understand more about the tribal territories and reservation boundaries. Bill was a grizzled former mountain man who'd seen enough of the frontier to respect both its beauty and its dangers. When Jed explained what he was looking for, the old trader's eyes lit with interest. "Lakota bands that raised a bear cub, you say?" Bill scratched his whiskers thoughtfully. "That'd be unusual, but not unheard of. Some of the northern bands had traditions about guardian spirits taking animal form." He pulled out a hand-drawn map that showed the various reservation boundaries and tribal territories. Course, most of them got moved to Pine Ridge or Standing Rock after the Troubles in '76. Jed studied the map, noting the vast distances involved. Pine Ridge was nearly 300 miles northeast, while Standing Rock lay even farther in that direction. Both journeys would require weeks of travel through territory that remained unpredictable and potentially dangerous. "You thinking of trying to return that bear to his people?" Bill asked. "Thinking about it," Jed admitted, "though I'm not sure how practical it is." Bill was quiet for a long moment, studying Jed's weathered face with the shrewd eyes of a man who'd learned to read character quickly and accurately. "You know, Jed, I've dealt with native folks for most of my adult life, traded with them, fought alongside some of them, fought against others when circumstances required it. One thing I learned is that they don't forget their sacred obligations, even when everything else gets taken away from them." "What do you mean?" "I mean, if that bear really was considered a guardian spirit by his adopted tribe, there'll be people on those reservations who remember him. People who've been waiting and hoping for his return, even after all these years." Bill folded the map carefully. "Might be worth sending word ahead, seeing if anyone recognizes the description." The idea of sending word to the reservations hadn't occurred to Jed, but it made sense. If nothing else, it might help him identify which specific band had raised Quiet Thunder, narrowing down his search considerably. As he walked back toward town with the borrowed map tucked into his shirt pocket, Jed felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of mission that went beyond personal survival or financial gain. For the first time since retiring from bounty hunting, he had a purpose that felt truly meaningful. But as he approached the cage, where Quiet Thunder waited with patient dignity, Jed was also acutely aware of the risks involved. He had less than $5 left to his name, winter was approaching, and he was contemplating a journey that could easily take months to complete. If he failed, both he and the bear would likely end up dead in some remote canyon, their bones picked clean by scavengers. Yet when he looked into Quiet Thunder's intelligent eyes and saw the hope flickering there like a candle flame in the darkness, Jed knew he didn't really have a choice. Some things were worth risking everything for, and returning this sacred creature to his rightful home was definitely one of them. "What do you say, old friend?" Jed asked quietly. "Ready to go home?" Quiet Thunder's response was immediate and unmistakable, a sound somewhere between a growl and a purr that spoke of anticipation, gratitude, and a trust so complete it took Jed's breath away. The old bounty hunter's badge felt cold against Jed's. Impalm, as he sat in the pre-dawn darkness, weighing it in his hand like a gambler, considering his final bet. 30 years of service to territorial law, 30 years of tracking down men who'd chosen violence and theft over honest work, and what did he have to show for it? A handful of silver dollars, an aging horse, and a reputation that meant less. With each passing season, but now, looking at Quiet Thunder sleeping peacefully in the cage beside him, Jed realized that badge represented something else entirely, a life spent following other people's definitions of justice instead of listening to his own conscience. Every wanted poster he'd pursued, every dangerous criminal he'd brought in, had been someone else's problem that he'd solved for money. This was different. This was personal. "Never thought I'd be planning to become an outlaw myself," he murmured to the bear, who opened one dark eye at the sound of his voice, because that's what he'd be, technically speaking, once he took Quiet Thunder out of that cage and headed north toward the reservations. Stealing livestock was a hanging offense in most territories, and a bear, even one purchased legally, would likely be considered livestock under territorial law. If Sheriff Carver came after them, Jed would be trading his badge for a wanted poster with his own face on it. The irony wasn't lost on him. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jed heard the approach of multiple horses. He stood slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the Colt 45 on his hip before he recognized the riders. Pete Crowley led a group of 5 men, all of them armed and wearing the grim expressions of people who'd come to deliver an ultimatum. "Morning." "Cole," Crowley called out as he dismounted, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "We need to have a conversation." "About what, Pete?" "About that bear of yours causing problems for decent folks." Crowley gestured toward his companions, who had spread out in a loose semicircle. "Mrs. Henderson's children won't play outside anymore, scared that thing might break loose. Tom Hastings is worried about his store being so close to a wild animal. Hell, even the preacher's concerned about having an unnatural creature so near the church." Jed noticed that Quiet Thunder had risen to his feet inside the cage, his massive frame tense with awareness of the potential threat. The bear's eyes moved from man to man, evaluating each one with the careful attention of a creature that had learned to read human intentions. "What exactly are you proposing, Pete?" Crowley's smile was cold and predatory. "Simple solution. We put that beast out of its misery, end the problem before it starts. Do it humane-like, quick and clean. Then you can get back to your retirement without all this foolishness. And if I refuse? Well, now, that'd be unfortunate." Crowley glanced at his companions, receiving subtle nods of agreement. "See, we talked to Sheriff Carver about the territorial statute regarding dangerous animals. Turns out, if that bear poses a clear and present danger to public safety, the law allows for immediate action by concerned citizens." The threat was unmistakable, but Jed had faced down more dangerous men than Pete Crowley during his bounty hunting. Years. What concerned him more was the presence of Doc Morrison among Crowley's group, The doctor was a reasonable man under normal circumstances, not given to vigilante solutions. "Doc," Jed said, addressing Morrison directly, "this doesn't seem like your usual way of handling problems." Morrison had the grace to look uncomfortable. "It's not about wanting to hurt the animal, Jed. It's about preventing a tragedy before it happens. That bear is too large and powerful to be controlled by one man. Sooner or later, someone's going to get hurt. He's been nothing but gentle since. I bought him, for now," Morrison replied. "But wild animals are unpredictable. Their instincts can override their training without warning. I've seen what bear attacks can do to the human body, Jed. It's not something I'd wish on anyone." Jed could see the genuine concern in the doctor's eyes, and it made the conversation more complicated than a simple confrontation with Crowley's bullying. These men weren't acting out of malice. They were acting out of fear, and fear had a way of making even good people do terrible things. "Give me the week Sheriff Carver promised," Jed said finally. "I'll have the bear out of town within 7 days. You have my word on that." Crowley shook his head. "Not good enough, Cole. That animal goes today, or we handle it ourselves." The standoff stretched for several long seconds, tension crackling in the morning air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Jed's hand moved closer to his gun, but he was acutely aware that he was outnumbered 5-1. If this turned into a gunfight, both he and Quiet Thunder would likely end up dead. Then the bear did something that changed everything. Quiet Thunder moved to the front of his cage and sat down in his characteristic dignified posture, placing his massive paws flat on the ground in a gesture that was unmistakably peaceful. Then he made a soft chuffing sound, not aggressive or threatening, but almost conversational, as if he were trying to join the discussion. The effect on Crowley's group was immediate and visible. Several of the men took involuntary steps backward, their eyes wide with surprise at the bear's unexpected behavior. This wasn't the snarling, dangerous beast they'd expected to confront. "Jesus!" whispered one of the riders. "Look at the way he's sitting, almost like he understands what we're talking about." Doc Morrison moved closer to the cage, his scientific curiosity overriding his caution. "That's remarkable. I've never seen posture like that in a wild animal." "It's almost human," finished another man, his voice barely audible. Quiet Thunder seemed to sense the shift in the group's mood. He tilted his massive head slightly and made another soft sound, this one even more gentle than the first. It was a sound that spoke of intelligence, patience, and an almost supernatural understanding of the situation. "What the hell kind of bear is that?" Crowley demanded, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "The kind that's been treated like family instead of livestock," Jed replied quietly. "The kind that understands loyalty and trust and kindness because that's how he was raised." Morrison was studying Quiet Thunder with fascination. "Where did you say this bear came from originally?" Lakota Band in the Black Hills raised him from a cub, treated him like a member of the tribe, called him Quiet Thunder. The name seemed to resonate with something in Morrison's memory. He frowned, searching his recollection. "Quiet Thunder. I've heard that name before, but I can't place where." "Probably in one of your medical journals," Crowley said dismissively, though he too seemed affected by the bear's unexpected behavior. "Some scientific paper about animal training or circus acts." But Morrison was shaking his head slowly. "No, it wasn't medical literature. It was something else. Something about—" His eyes widened suddenly. "The treaty negotiations at Fort Laramie. In '68, I was there as part of the military medical corps. There was a Lakota chief who spoke about guardian spirits, creatures that had been blessed by the Great Spirit to protect their people." He paused, his gaze fixed on Quiet Thunder with growing understanding. One of the spirits he described was a great bear marked with the crescent moon, a creature called Quiet Thunder who had chosen to live among the people as a bridge between the world of animals and the world of men. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Even Crowley seemed stunned by the implications of what Morrison had just shared. "You're saying this bear—" one of the riders began. "I'm saying This might not be just any bear, Morrison replied slowly. If Chief Red Cloud was telling the truth during those negotiations, this animal could be something far more significant than we realized. Jed felt a chill run down his spine. Red Cloud was a name every man on the frontier knew, one of the most respected and feared Lakota leaders, a chief whose word carried weight even among his enemies. If Red Cloud had spoken about Quiet Thunder during official treaty negotiations, it meant the bear's significance went far beyond what Jed had initially understood. Crowley's face had gone pale. Whatever his faults, he wasn't stupid enough to ignore the potential consequences of harming an animal that might be considered sacred by one of the most powerful native leaders in the region. "This is all speculation," Crowley said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Could be any bear with similar markings." Morrison moved even closer to the cage, studying the crescent-shaped patch on Quiet Thunder's paw. The markings match the description exactly. And look at his behavior. This isn't typical animal conditioning. This is something else entirely. As if to emphasize Morrison's point, Quiet Thunder rose to his feet and moved to the back corner of the cage, where he'd hidden the carved bone token. He retrieved it carefully and brought it to the front of the cage, placing it where Morrison could see it clearly. The doctor's sharp intake of breath was audible to everyone present. "That's a ceremonial marker. Lakota craftsmanship, probably. Dating back at least a decade." He looked up at Jed with new respect. "This bear isn't just trained. He's been initiated into tribal ceremonies. He's carrying sacred objects." The implications of this discovery hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. If Quiet Thunder really was the guardian spirit described by Red Cloud, then harming him wouldn't just be cruel. It would be an act that could have serious political and spiritual consequences for everyone involved. Crowley's group was beginning to back away from the cage, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of this unexpected revelation. Even the most prejudiced settler understood the importance of respecting native spiritual beliefs, if only to avoid the kind of retaliation that could turn a simple frontier dispute into a bloody war. "We need to think about this," Crowley said. Finally, his voice subdued. "If this bear really is what Morrison thinks he might be, then killing him could bring down all kinds of trouble on Deadwood Gulch." As the group mounted their horses and rode away, their voices carrying intense discussion about the morning's revelations, Jed found himself alone with Quiet Thunder and a new understanding of the magnitude of his responsibility. This wasn't just about giving one bear his freedom anymore. This was about returning a sacred being to his people, honoring a spiritual obligation that transcended the petty concerns of frontier politics and territorial law. The badge in his pocket felt heavier than ever, but for the first time in years, Jed knew exactly what he needed to do with it. The old brass compass had belonged to Jed's father, carried through the Mexican War and later through the early days of westward expansion. Now it lay open in Jed's weathered palm, its needle pointing steadily north toward a destiny he was only beginning to understand. The instrument's face was scratched and tarnished, but it still held true, much like the man who'd passed it down to his son with the simple advice to always know which direction you're heading. 3 days had passed since Crowley's confrontation, and word of Quiet Thunder's possible spiritual significance had spread through Deadwood Gulch like wildfire through dry grass. The reaction had been mixed. Some townspeople were now treating the bear with a reverence that bordered on awe, while others remained skeptical of what they saw as superstitious nonsense. But everyone agreed on one thing: the situation had become far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Jed had spent those 3 days making careful preparations for a journey he wasn't sure he'd survive. His first stop had been Bill Hawkins' trading post, where the old mountain man had helped him plan a route that would avoid the most dangerous territories while still heading generally northeast toward the Pine Ridge Reservation. "You'll want to stay west of the Badlands," Bill had advised, tracing a finger along the hand-drawn map. Terrain's rough, but it's better than trying to cross Sioux hunting grounds without an invitation. Follow the Cheyenne River north until you hit the White River, then turn east toward Pine Ridge. The route would add weeks to the journey, but it offered the best chance of reaching the reservation without encountering hostile war parties or territorial militias who might not appreciate an ex-bounty hunter traveling with a sacred bear. What about supplies? Jed had asked. Bill had considered this carefully. You'll need enough food for at least 6 weeks, plus grain for your horse and meat for the bear. Water won't be a problem if you stick to the river routes, but you'll want a good rifle for hunting. And protection. He'd paused, studying Jed's face. Course, none of this matters if you can't figure out how to transport a 600-pound bear across 300 miles of wilderness. That had been the most challenging aspect of the planning. The iron cage was far too heavy for overland travel, and Quiet Thunder was too large to be effectively restrained by conventional methods. After much consideration, Jed had come up with a solution that relied more on trust than technology. Working with the town's blacksmith, he'd commissioned a lightweight harness made of leather and chain, strong enough to provide security if needed, but designed primarily to give Quiet Thunder the freedom to walk alongside Bess during the journey. The harness could be removed entirely once they were away from civilization, allowing the bear to travel as his ancestors had for countless generations. The blacksmith, a practical German immigrant named Klaus Weber, had initially been skeptical of the design. "You sure this bear won't just run off first chance he gets?" Klaus had asked while fitting the leather straps. "If he wants to run, he'll run whether we've got chains on him or not," Jed had replied. "At least this way, he'll know. He's traveling with friends instead of captors." Now, as evening shadows stretched across the camp, Jed was testing the harness for the final time. Quiet Thunder had accepted the lightweight restraint with his characteristic patience, understanding somehow that this represented a step toward freedom rather than another form of captivity. "Tomorrow morning, old friend," Jed said quietly, adjusting the leather straps around the bear's massive chest. "We head north toward your people." Quiet Thunder's response was a soft rumble that spoke of anticipation mixed with something that might have been gratitude. The bear had grown increasingly restless over the past few days, as if he sensed that significant changes were approaching. As Jed worked, Doc Morrison approached the camp, carrying a leather satchel and wearing an expression of serious purpose. The doctor had become a frequent visitor since the revelation about Quiet Thunder's possible spiritual significance, spending hours observing the bear's behavior and taking careful notes. "Evening, Jed," Morrison said. "Mind if I join you for a few minutes?" "Course not, Doc. What's on your mind?" Morrison set down his satchel and pulled out a small notebook filled with his careful observations. "I've been thinking about what we discussed the other day, about Chief Red Cloud's description of the guardian spirit bear, an institution in Washington. Dr. Catherine Mills. She's one of the foremost experts on Plains Indian spiritual traditions." Jed looked up from adjusting the harness. "What did she have to say?" "More than I expected," Morrison replied, his voice carrying a note of excitement. "Apparently, the story of Quiet Thunder is well documented in academic circles. Dr. Mills has been studying the bear's significance for years, trying to understand the role of animal spirits in Lakota culture." He flipped to another page in his notebook. "According to her research, Quiet Thunder isn't just any guardian spirit. He's specifically associated with the transition between the old ways and the new. The Lakota believe he appears during times of great change, helping his people navigate difficult periods in their history. The implications of this information hit Jed like a physical blow. If Morrison was right, then Quiet Thunder's appearance in his life wasn't coincidental. It was part of some larger pattern that he was only beginning to understand. "There's more," Morrison continued. "Dr. Mills believes that Quiet Thunder's capture and subsequent years in captivity represent a kind of spiritual exile, a separation from his people that has disrupted the natural balance of things. She thinks his return could be extremely significant for the tribal communities on the reservations. Jed studied Quiet Thunder's intelligent eyes, seeing them in a new light. What kind of significance? Hope, Morrison said simply. These people have lost so much. Their land, their freedom, their traditional ways of life. The return of their guardian spirit could provide the kind of spiritual renewal they desperately need. As if understanding the conversation, Quiet Thunder moved closer to the two men and sat in his characteristic pose of dignified attention. In the fading light, his massive form seemed to radiate a kind of calm authority that was difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore. "There's something else you should know," Morrison added, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "I've been in communication with the Indian agency at Pine Ridge. They're aware that you're planning to bring Quiet Thunder to the reservation." Jed felt a chill of concern. The Indian agency was a federal bureaucracy known for its rigid enforcement of regulations and its general hostility toward anything that might be seen as encouraging traditional native practices. And their response? Mixed, Morrison admitted. On one hand, they're concerned about introducing a large predator into the reservation environment. On the other hand, they're very interested in avoiding any actions that might cause unrest among the tribal communities. He closed his notebook and looked directly at Jed. "What I'm saying is that you're walking into a political situation that's a lot more complicated than just returning a bear to his people. There are federal agents, tribal leaders, and local officials, all with their own agendas and concerns." The magnitude of what he was attempting was beginning to dawn on Jed. This wasn't simply a matter of transporting an animal across difficult terrain. It was an act that could have far-reaching consequences for relationships between native communities. "And the federal government, are you having second thoughts?" Morrison asked, noting Jed's troubled expression. Jed looked at Quiet Thunder, who was watching him with those impossibly expressive eyes. In that gaze, he saw patience, trust, and an unwavering faith that somehow, despite all the obstacles and complications, things would work out as they were meant to. "No," Jed said finally. "No second thoughts. Whatever happens when we get to Pine Ridge, it's got to be better than leaving him to waste away in a cage or end up in Crowley's fighting." "Pit," Morrison nodded approvingly. "I thought you'd say that, which is why I have something for you." He opened his leather satchel and pulled out a folded document bearing official seals and signatures. "It's a letter of introduction from Dr. Mills at the Smithsonian, explaining your mission and requesting cooperation from federal and tribal authorities. It won't solve all your problems, but it might open some doors that would otherwise remain closed." Jed accepted the document with gratitude that went beyond words. In his years as a bounty hunter, he'd learned to appreciate the value of official paperwork when dealing with bureaucratic obstacles. "There's one more thing," Morrison said, reaching into his satchel again. This time he pulled out a small leather pouch that seemed to glow faintly in the firelight. "This came with Dr. Mills' letter. She said it contains sacred objects that belonged to Quiet Thunder's original tribal family, items that were collected by researchers years ago and have been preserved at the Smithsonian." The pouch felt warm in Jed's hands, as if it contained something more than mere artifacts. When he opened it carefully, he found several small items: a piece of carved antler, a smooth stone painted with symbolic designs, and a braided cord made from sweetgrass and sage. Quiet Thunder's reaction to these objects was immediate and profound. The bear rose to his full height and made a sound Jed had never heard before, a deep, resonant call that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his physical form. It was a sound of recognition, of homecoming, of spiritual completion. "Well," Morrison said quietly, "I think that confirms Dr. Mills' research." As night settled over Deadwood Gulch and the last lights flickered out in the town's windows, Jed sat beside Quiet Thunder's cage and contemplated the journey ahead. The compass in his pocket pointed steadily north, toward a destination that represented far more than a simple geographical location. Tomorrow, they would leave the familiar world of frontier towns and territorial law behind, venturing into a realm where the old ways still held power and where a bear could be so much more than just an animal. The prospect was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a vast canyon and preparing to leap across to the other side. But as Jed looked at his unlikely companion, now resting peacefully with his sacred objects arranged carefully around him, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of absolute certainty about the rightness of his path. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, man and bear united in a quest that transcended the boundaries of species and culture. The compass would keep them pointed in the right direction, but their hearts would guide them home. The medicine bundle felt ancient in Jed's trembling hands, its worn leather surface bearing symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light in the pre-dawn darkness. He'd never seen it before, yet something about its weight and texture felt achingly familiar, like a half-remembered dream from childhood that lingered just beyond the reach of conscious memory. The old Lakota man who'd appeared at their camp like a ghost, materialized from morning mist, sat across the dying fire, his weathered face impossible to read in the flickering shadows. He'd arrived without sound or warning just as Jed was making his final preparations for departure, leading a paint horse and carrying himself with the dignified bearing of someone accustomed to command. "You do not remember me, Washichu," the elder had said, using the Lakota word for white man, though his tone carried no hostility. "But I remember you. I remember the boy who saved my grandson's life 37 winters ago." The words had hit Jed like a physical blow, unlocking memories he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself they'd never happened. Suddenly, he was 12 years old again, living with his father in a remote trading post near the Powder River, watching a Lakota boy about his own age struggle to escape the grip of a flooding creek's current. Jed had acted without thinking, plunging into the icy water and managing to pull the drowning boy to safety. The child's grandfather, this same man, though 3 decades younger, had arrived moments later with a search party, finding both boys exhausted but alive on the muddy riverbank. "Little Bear," Jed whispered, the name coming back to him after all these years. "His name was Little Bear," the elder nodded slowly. "His name is now Joseph Crow Feather, and he serves as a tribal councilman at Pine Ridge. But yes, he was Little Bear when you saved him from the water spirits." He gestured toward the medicine bundle. "This belonged to his mother, my daughter. She made it for you as a gift of gratitude, but you and your father left the trading post before we could present it properly." Jed's father had indeed moved them away quickly after that incident, uncomfortable with the attention their heroic act had drawn from both native and white communities. Samuel Cole had been a practical man who believed in avoiding complications, and the growing friendship between his son and the local Lakota band had struck him as potentially problematic. "She wanted you to have this," the elder continued, "because she saw something in you that day, something the spirits had marked for a special purpose." His dark eyes shifted to where Quiet Thunder sat in patient silence, listening to every word with extraordinary attention. "Now I understand what that purpose was. Who are you?" Jed asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "I am Thomas Crow Feather, medicine man and keeper of the sacred stories for my people, and I am here because the spirits told me that Quiet Thunder had finally found the one who would bring him home." The implications of this revelation staggered Jed. His decision to buy the bear at auction hadn't been random impulse. It had been the fulfillment of a destiny that had been set in motion decades earlier by a single act of childhood courage. "You're saying this was always supposed to happen?" Jed asked. Thomas Crow Feather's expression remained serene. "The spirits do not force our choices, but they prepare the path for those choices to matter. You could have walked away from that auction. You could have ignored the bear's plea for help, but something in your heart recognized what your mind had forgotten. that you and Quiet Thunder were connected by bonds stronger than time or distance. As if responding to his name, Quiet Thunder rose and moved to the edge of his cage, his massive form silhouetted against the lightning sky. When he saw Thomas Crow Feather, the bear's entire demeanor changed. He made a sound, half growl, half whimper, that spoke of recognition and overwhelming emotion. Thomas stood slowly, his aged joints protesting the movement, and approached. The cage with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Mato Inila," he said softly, using the Lakota name for Quiet Thunder. "My old friend, we have waited so long for your return." The reunion between man and bear was unlike anything Jed had ever witnessed. Quiet Thunder pressed his massive body against the cage bars, straining to get closer to the medicine man who had clearly been an important part of his early life. Thomas reached through the bars to touch the bear's fur, murmuring words in Lakota that sounded like prayers of gratitude and welcome. "He was just a cub when the soldiers came," Thomas explained, his voice thick with memory. "No bigger than a large dog, but already showing signs of the special gifts the spirits had given him. We had raised him since birth, after his mother was killed by hunters. He was like a member of our family." "What happened when the army arrived?" Thomas's expression darkened. "Colonel Marcus Whitmore decided that our band posed a threat to the mining operations in the Black Hills. He gave us 3 days to move to the reservation, but he refused to allow us to take Quiet Thunder. Said a dangerous wild animal had no place among civilized people." The name Whitmore sent a chill through Jed's memory. He'd encountered the colonel during his early bounty hunting days, a cruel, ambitious man who'd built his career on the systematic destruction of native communities throughout the territory. "We had to choose," Thomas continued. "Resist and watch our people die in a hopeless fight, or leave Quiet Thunder behind and pray that somehow, someday, he would find his way back to us." His voice broke slightly. "It was the hardest decision I have ever made." Jed found himself thinking about all the times during his bounty hunting career when he'd worked for men like Whitmore, pursuing native people who'd been labeled as criminals for trying to protect their traditional ways of life. How many families had he helped tear apart in the name of territorial law and order? "There's something else you need to know," Thomas said, reaching into a leather pouch at his belt, "about why the spirits chose you for this task." He pulled out a small object wrapped in soft deerskin. When he unwrapped it, Jed saw a carved piece of bone, identical to the token Quiet Thunder had kept hidden throughout his years of captivity. "This was made by my daughter as a companion piece to the one Quiet Thunder carries. She intended to give it to you along with the medicine bundle as a symbol of the bond between your family and ours." Thomas held the carving up to the morning light, revealing intricate symbols that seemed to dance and shift in the growing illumination. "It marks you as a brother to our people, someone who has earned the right to walk between worlds." The weight of this revelation was staggering. For 30 years, Jed had carried the guilt of his participation in the systematic oppression of native communities, never knowing that he'd already been claimed as family by the very people he'd helped to persecute. "But there's more," Thomas continued, his expression growing grave. "Your arrival with Quiet Thunder comes at a time of great crisis for our people. The government has announced new policies that will restrict our religious practices even further. They plan to forbid all traditional ceremonies, including those involving animal spirits." This was news to Jed, and it explained the mixed reaction Doc Morrison had described from the Indian Agency officials at Pine Ridge. The federal government wasn't just concerned about the practical aspects of introducing a large predator to the reservation. They were worried about the spiritual and political implications of Quiet Thunder's return. "If they discover that you're bringing a sacred guardian spirit back to our people, they will do everything in their power to stop you," Thomas warned. "Colonel Whitmore himself has been placed in charge of the new religious suppression policies. He's specifically been ordered to prevent any activities that might encourage traditional beliefs." The mention of Whitmore's continued involvement sent ice through Jed's veins. The man had aged, certainly, but his hatred for native communities had only grown more sophisticated and bureaucratic over the years. "What are you suggesting?" Jed asked. "I'm suggesting that this journey is far more dangerous than you realized. You're not just transporting a bear to a reservation, you're carrying hope itself back to a people who have had everything else taken from them." Thomas's eyes held depths of wisdom accumulated over decades of struggle and loss. "Whitmore will see Quiet Thunder's return as a direct challenge to his authority. He won't hesitate to use lethal force to prevent it, as the full magnitude of what he'd undertaken became clear." Jed felt the familiar weight of the badge in his pocket. For 30 years, he'd served the same system that had created men like Whitmore, enforcing laws that had systematically destroyed everything Thomas Crowfeather's people held sacred. But now, holding the medicine bundle and the carved bone token, he understood that he'd been given a chance for redemption that went far beyond his personal relationship with Quiet Thunder. This was an opportunity to make amends for decades of complicity and injustice, to use his skills and knowledge to protect rather than persecute. "There's something else," Thomas said, studying Jed's face carefully. "Little Bear, Joseph Crowfeather, has become one of our most effective advocates in dealing with government officials. He's been working for years to create opportunities for our young people to maintain connections with traditional ways while still adapting to the new world." He paused, his expression growing thoughtful. "He's never forgotten that a white boy once risked his life to save him. He's often said that if he could find you again, he would ask for your help in bridging the gap between our peoples." The circle was completing itself in ways that Jed could never have imagined. The drowning boy he'd saved 37 years earlier had grown into a man working to preserve the very culture that Jed had unknowingly helped to suppress. Now, through Quiet Thunder, they had a chance to work together toward healing wounds that had been festering for decades. "Will you help us?" Thomas asked simply. Jed looked at Quiet Thunder, who was watching him with those impossibly intelligent eyes. In that gaze, he saw not just a plea for freedom, but a request for something far more profound, a chance to restore balance to a world that had been thrown into chaos by fear, greed, and cultural misunderstanding. The medicine bundle felt warm in his hands, as if it contained not just sacred objects, but the accumulated hopes and prayers of generations of people who had refused to give up on the possibility of redemption. "Yes," Jed said quietly, and as the word left his lips, he felt something fundamental shift inside him. The man who had spent 30 years hunting people for money was gone, replaced by someone committed to protecting what was sacred, regardless of the personal cost. Thomas Crowfeather smiled, and for the first time since Jed had met him, the old medicine man looked genuinely hopeful. "Then let us begin the real journey, my brother. Quiet Thunder has waited long enough to come home." As the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jed realized that everything he'd thought he knew about his life, his purpose, and his destiny had been fundamentally transformed by this unexpected encounter. The path ahead would be more dangerous than he'd imagined, but it would also be more meaningful than anything he'd ever attempted. The boy who had saved a drowning child 37 years ago was about to complete a circle of redemption that would honor both the sacred and the human in ways that could heal wounds stretching back generations. The Winchester rifle felt different in Jed's hands now, its familiar weight carrying new meaning as he checked the action one final time. For 30 years, this weapon had been a tool of his trade, used to bring down dangerous men for bounty money. Now it would serve a different purpose entirely, protecting something sacred from those who would destroy it out of fear or prejudice. Thomas Crowfeather had spent the morning sharing crucial intelligence about the challenges they would face on the journey to Pine Ridge. The old medicine man's network of contacts throughout the territory had revealed disturbing news about Colonel Whitmore's activities and the government's growing determination to suppress traditional native spiritual practices. Whitmore has positioned soldiers at 3 key crossing points along the main routes to Pine Ridge, Thomas explained, sketching rough maps in the dirt beside their camp. He's calling it a routine patrol operation, but my sources tell me he's specifically looking for anyone attempting to transport dangerous animals to reservation lands. Jed studied the crude map, noting how the patrol positions would effectively block all the obvious approaches to the reservation. He knows we're coming. Not specifically, but he suspects. Word has spread about the sacred bear in Deadwood Gulch, and Whitmore understands the significance such a creature would have for our people. Thomas's expression was grim. He's determined to prevent any action that might encourage traditional beliefs among the tribal communities. The weight of their undertaking pressed down on Jed like a physical burden. They weren't just attempting to transport a large animal across difficult terrain. They were carrying the hopes and spiritual renewal of an entire people, while being hunted by federal forces with authorization to use lethal force. There is another way, Thomas said quietly, his finger tracing a different path on the improvised map. An old hunting trail that follows the Little Missouri River north through the Badlands. It's dangerous terrain, and it will add 2 weeks to our journey, but it avoids all of Whitmore's patrol routes. Jed studied the alternative path, noting how it wound through some of the most treacherous landscape in the territory. The Badlands were a maze of eroded canyons and unstable rock formations, where a single wrong turn could lead to impassable dead ends or deadly falls. What about water and forage for the animals? The river provides water, and there are hidden meadows in some of the canyon bottoms where our people have sheltered during times of trouble. It won't be easy, but it's possible. Thomas met Jed's eyes directly. The question is whether you're willing to risk everything on a path that might kill us all before we ever reach our destination. Before Jed could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention toward town. Sheriff Carver was riding hard toward their camp, his face tight with concern and urgency. Behind him rode Doc Morrison and, surprisingly, Bill Hawkins from the trading post. "Jed," Carver called out as he dismounted. "We need to talk now." The sheriff's expression was more serious than Jed had ever seen it, carrying the weight of a man who'd received news that changed everything. "What's happened, Dan?" "Federal marshals arrived in town an hour ago. 3 of them, led by a man named Captain Ross. They're carrying arrest warrants and authority to confiscate any dangerous wildlife being transported without proper federal permits." Doc Morrison dismounted and approached the group, his medical bag slung over his shoulder and his face pale with worry. "They're asking specifically about you, Jed, and about the bear. Someone's given them detailed information about your plans." The betrayal hit Jed like a physical blow. Someone in Deadwood Gulch had contacted federal authorities and provided intelligence about their intended journey. The list of people who knew enough details to be useful to government agents was distressingly short. "Any idea who?" Jed asked. "Bill." Hawkins stepped forward, his weathered face twisted with disgust. "Pete Crowley. I saw him talking with the marshals when they first rode into town. Looked mighty pleased with himself about something." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Crowley's sudden retreat from confrontation 3 days earlier hadn't been due to respect for Quiet Thunder's spiritual significance. It had been a strategic withdrawal while he contacted federal authorities who could do what he and his friends couldn't accomplish through local pressure. "How long do we have?" Thomas asked, his voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. Sheriff Carver checked his pocket watch. "Captain Ross said they'd be riding out here within the hour to serve the warrants and take possession of the bear. I came as fast as I could to give you warning." An hour. It wasn't nearly enough time to implement their carefully planned departure for the Badlands route, but it might be sufficient for a desperate alternative that had been taking shape in Jed's mind as they talked. "Thomas," Jed said urgently, "how well do you know the country between here and the old trading post where my father used to work?" The medicine man's eyes sharpened with understanding. Very well. It's traditional hunting grounds for my people. Though we haven't used them since the army forced us onto the reservation. Could we reach the Little Missouri through that route without using any of the main trails? Yes, but it would require traveling cross-country through rough terrain. With the bear in that cage, it would be impossible. Jed looked at Quiet Thunder, who had been listening to the entire conversation with alert attention. The bear's intelligent eyes seemed to understand the urgency of their situation, and something in his posture suggested he was prepared for whatever came next. "Then we don't use the cage," Jed said quietly. The implications of this decision hit everyone present simultaneously. Transporting a 600-pound grizzly bear across open country without restraints would require a level of trust between man and animal that bordered on the supernatural. Doc Morrison shook his head in amazement. "Jed, that's incredibly dangerous. Even if the bear doesn't attack you, there's no guarantee he'll follow you instead of just wandering off into the wilderness." "He'll follow," Thomas said with quiet certainty. "Quiet Thunder understands that. Jed is taking him home. The bond between them is stronger than any chain or cage." As if to confirm Thomas's words, Quiet Thunder moved to the front of his cage and made a soft chuffing sound that seemed directed at Jed personally. The bear's eyes held an expression of absolute trust, as if he were saying he was ready to follow wherever Jed chose to lead. Sheriff Carver was staring at them all as if they'd lost their minds. "You're talking about releasing a grizzly bear and then riding cross-country with him like he's a trained dog. That's not just dangerous, it's suicide." "Maybe," Jed admitted, "but it's the only chance we have of getting him to his people before federal agents decide he needs to be destroyed as a public menace." The next 45 minutes passed in a blur of frantic preparation. Thomas helped Jed load essential supplies onto Bess, while Bill Hawkins provided additional ammunition and emergency medical supplies from his trading post inventory. Doc Morrison contributed morphine and surgical instruments in case someone gets mauled. Though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely joking, Sheriff Carver had initially tried to talk them out of the desperate plan. But as the time for the federal agent's arrival grew closer, he'd shifted to providing practical assistance. "If anyone asks, I'll tell them you headed south toward Colorado territory," he promised. "That should buy you a few extra hours before they figure out which direction you really went." As Jed unlocked Quiet Thunder's cage for what he hoped would be the final time, he felt the weight of 3 decades of law enforcement experience arguing against what he was about to do. Every instinct developed through years of tracking dangerous men told him that freeing a large predator without restraints was an act of monumental foolishness. But when Quiet Thunder stepped out of the cage and immediately moved to stand beside Bess, showing no inclination to flee or attack, Jed realized that all his professional experience was irrelevant to this situation. This wasn't about law enforcement or animal control. This was about honoring a sacred obligation that transcended normal human understanding. Thomas approached Quiet Thunder and spoke to him in soft Lakota, his words carrying the cadence of prayer or blessing. The bear listened with rapt attention, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed like responses to the medicine man's guidance. "I've told him that you will lead him home to his people," Thomas explained to Jed. "I've also asked him to protect you as you protect him, because your lives are now bound together by sacred trust." The sound of approaching horses carried clearly across the morning air. The federal marshals were ahead of schedule, probably pushed by Crowley's eagerness to see his plan succeed. In a few minutes, Captain Ross and his men would arrive, expecting to find a caged bear and a compliant citizen ready to surrender to federal authority. Instead, they would find an empty camp and a mystery that might take hours or days to unravel. "Time to go," Jed said, swinging up onto Bess's back and checking to make sure his rifle was secure in its scabbard. Quiet Thunder looked up at him with those impossibly intelligent eyes, and Jed could swear he saw something like determination in that ancient gaze. The bear understood that they were embarking on a journey that would test both of them beyond anything they'd experienced before. Thomas Crowfeather mounted his paint horse and positioned himself as a scout, ready to guide them through terrain that had been sacred to his people for countless generations. "The spirits are with us," he said quietly. "Quiet thunder will reach his home, and the circle that was broken 37 years ago will finally be complete." As they rode away from Deadwood Gulch with a massive grizzly bear trotting alongside their horses like the most natural thing in the world, Jed felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. Absolute faith that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The federal marshals would follow, certainly. The terrain ahead would be treacherous, without question. But for the first time in his adult life, Jedediah Cole was fighting for something that mattered more than money or personal survival. He was fighting for redemption itself, and that made all the difference in the world. The carved bone token felt warm against Jed's chest as he pressed himself against the canyon wall, listening to the echo of hoofbeats on stone growing closer with each passing moment. 3 days of hard travel through the Badlands had brought them tantalizingly close to Lakota hunting grounds, but it had also allowed Captain Ross and his federal marshals to close the distance between them. Quiet thunder crouched beside him. In the narrow cleft of rock, the bear's massive form surprisingly well concealed in the shadows of the red sandstone formation. The animal's breathing was controlled and silent, as if he understood instinctively that their lives depended on remaining undetected for the next few crucial minutes. Thomas Crowfeather was positioned 50 yards away on the opposite side of the canyon, ready to signal if the federal agents discovered their hiding place. The old medicine man had proven invaluable as a guide through the treacherous maze of eroded gullies and unstable rock formations, leading them along paths that existed more in tribal memory than on any territorial map. But Captain Ross had proven to be a more capable tracker than Jed had anticipated. The man combined military training with frontier experience, and he'd followed their trail through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate for anyone unfamiliar with the territory. The sound of horses grew louder, accompanied by voices that carried clearly in the thin air of the canyon. "Trail leads right up this draw," called out one of the marshals. "Fresh horse droppings, maybe 6 hours old." "Keep your eyes open," Ross replied, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Cole's an experienced tracker himself. He'll know we're following, and he won't make this easy." Jed recognized the voice. Ross had been a lieutenant during his own military service years earlier, a competent officer who'd earned his rank through merit rather than political connections. Under different circumstances, they might have been allies rather than adversaries. "Sir," another voice called out, "you sure about chasing a wanted man through Indian territory? If we run into a war party—" "These are reservation lands now," Ross interrupted. "Any natives we encounter are supposed to be peaceful farmers under federal protection. Besides, our authority extends to any territory where federal crimes are being committed." The irony of Ross's words wasn't lost on Jed. Here was a federal agent pursuing him for trying to return a sacred creature to its people, while claiming that those same people should be grateful for government protection that had systematically destroyed their traditional way of life. As the sound of the search party moved closer to their position, Quiet Thunder did something unexpected. The bear shifted slightly and made the softest possible sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a whisper, but something that seemed to carry meaning beyond normal animal communication. Thomas immediately responded from his position across the canyon, making a similar sound that somehow conveyed information about the federal agent's exact location and movements. Jed realized he was witnessing a form of communication that had developed between the medicine man and the bear during their years together. A language that transcended the boundaries between human and animal consciousness. The knowledge that Quiet Thunder and Thomas could coordinate their actions, opened up tactical possibilities that Ross and his men wouldn't anticipate. They were tracking what they believed to be two men and a dangerous animal moving through unfamiliar territory. They had no idea they were pursuing a coordinated team that included someone who understood this landscape at a spiritual level. "There," one of the marshals called out suddenly, "movement on the ridge above the canyon floor." Jed's heart stopped as he realized they'd been spotted. But when he looked toward the position the marshal was indicating, he saw Thomas Crowfeather deliberately exposing himself on a rocky outcrop nearly a quarter-mile away from their actual hiding place. The old medicine man was creating a diversion, drawing the federal agents away from Jed and Quiet Thunder's position at considerable risk to himself. If Ross's men cornered Thomas in that exposed position, the confrontation could easily turn deadly. "That's one of them," Ross announced, his voice carrying grim satisfaction. "Johnson, take Martinez and circle around to the north. We'll approach from the south and catch him in a crossfire." The federal agents were spreading out, implementing tactics designed to capture or kill a dangerous fugitive. They had no way of knowing that Thomas was deliberately leading them into a trap of his own devising, using their assumptions about native capabilities against them. As the marshals moved away from Jed's position in pursuit of Thomas, Quiet Thunder made another soft sound and gestured with his massive head toward a narrow passage that led deeper into the canyon system. The bear's meaning was clear. They needed to move now, while the federal agents were distracted, to reach a position where they could help Thomas if the confrontation went badly. Jed checked his rifle and followed Quiet Thunder through the maze of stone corridors, marveling at how the bear navigated the complex terrain with an understanding that seemed to go beyond normal animal instincts. This was sacred ground to Quiet Thunder's people, and he moved through it with the confidence of someone who belonged here. The sound of gunfire echoed through the canyon like thunder, sharp reports that spoke of serious intent rather than warning shots. Ross and his men had engaged Thomas in a firefight, and from the pattern of shots, it sounded like the old medicine man was outnumbered but holding his own. When they reached a position that offered a clear view of the confrontation, Jed saw Thomas, positioned behind a wall of fallen rocks, using the natural fortification to great advantage against the federal agents who were trying to approach from multiple directions. The medicine man's old military rifle spoke with deliberate precision, each shot carefully aimed to discourage rather than kill. But Ross's men had superior numbers and more ammunition. It was only a matter of time before they found a position that would allow them to overwhelm Thomas's defenses. "I have to help him," Jed said aloud, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to himself or to Quiet Thunder. The bear's response was immediate and unmistakable. He moved to the edge of the rocky shelf where they were positioned and made a sound that was unlike anything Jed had heard before. A deep, resonant call that seemed to come from the earth itself. The effect on the federal agents was instantaneous and dramatic. All firing stopped as the men looked around in confusion and growing fear, trying to locate the source of a sound that didn't fit any of their expectations about what they might encounter in this desolate landscape. "What the hell was that?" one of the marshals called out, his voice cracking with nervous tension. "Just the wind through the rocks," Ross replied, but his own voice carried uncertainty. "Stay focused on the target." Quiet Thunder made the call. Again, longer and more powerful this time, and the sound echoed through the canyon system until it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. To men unfamiliar with the spiritual traditions of the Plains tribes, it must have sounded like the voice of the land itself, expressing displeasure at their presence. Using the distraction, Jed moved to a position where he could support Thomas without exposing himself unnecessarily. His Winchester rifle had a longer range than the weapons the federal agents were carrying, and his elevated position offered clear lines of sight to all their positions. "Captain Ross," Jed called out, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed. Let us pass, and no one gets hurt. Jedediah Cole, Ross replied immediately. You're under arrest for violation of federal wildlife protection statutes and interference with government operations. Surrender yourself and the animal, and I guarantee you'll receive fair treatment under territorial law. The offer might have been tempting under other circumstances, but Jed knew that surrendering would mean death for Quiet Thunder and the destruction of hopes that had sustained Thomas's people through decades of systematic oppression. Can't do that, Captain. This bear belongs with his people, and I intend to see that he gets there. Quiet Thunder made his calling sound again, and this time it was answered by another voice from somewhere deeper in the canyon, a howl that spoke of wildness and freedom, and things that existed beyond the reach of federal authority. The marshals were growing increasingly nervous, and Jed could see them glancing around as if expecting to be surrounded by hostile forces at any moment. They'd come prepared to capture a fugitive and confiscate an animal, not to fight a battle in terrain that seemed to be actively working against them. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just their immediate fate, but the future of an entire people's spiritual heritage. The answering call from the canyon depths changed everything. What had begun as a pursuit by federal agents suddenly transformed into something far more complex and spiritually charged. The sound that echoed back to Quiet Thunder wasn't from another bear. It was the voice of Joseph Crow Feather, Thomas's grandson, the drowning boy Jed had saved 37 years earlier. "Grandfather," the voice called in English, carrying clearly across the stone formations. "We are here." From concealed positions throughout the canyon, figures began to emerge. Not the hostile war party that Captain Ross's men had feared, but a delegation of tribal elders and younger leaders who had been waiting at this traditional meeting place for Quiet Thunder's return. They moved with the quiet dignity of people who belong to this landscape, appearing as if the earth itself had given birth to them. Joseph Crow Feather stepped into view at the canyon floor, and even across the distance, Jed could see the resemblance to the boy he'd once pulled from the flooding creek. Tall and lean, with the bearing of someone accustomed to leadership, Joseph raised his hand in a gesture of peaceful greeting that was somehow also a clear demonstration of strength. "Captain Ross," Joseph called out, his voice carrying the authority of education and political experience. "I am Joseph Crow Feather, elected representative of the Pine Ridge Tribal Council. You are currently trespassing on treaty-protected lands without proper authorization." The effect of this announcement on the federal agents was immediate and profound. Ross and his men had believed they were pursuing fugitives through remote wilderness, not violating the sovereignty of an officially recognized tribal government. The legal implications of their unauthorized presence would create complications that could extend all the way to Washington. "This is a federal matter," Ross replied, but his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "We are pursuing a wanted criminal and a dangerous animal." "The man you call a criminal is the honored guest of our people," Joseph responded calmly. "The animal you call dangerous is a sacred being returning to his rightful home. Your presence here is both unwelcome and illegal." From his elevated position, Jed could see the uncertainty spreading through Ross's small force. They'd been prepared for a straightforward law enforcement operation, not a confrontation that involved treaty rights, tribal sovereignty, and the complex political relationships between federal and native governments. Quiet Thunder seemed to sense that the moment of crisis had arrived. The bear rose to his full, impressive height and made his calling sound once more, longer and more powerful than before. This time, the echo that came back was answered by multiple voices, not just Joseph, but the entire delegation of tribal representatives who had gathered to welcome their guardian spirit home. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, a harmony that spoke of traditions stretching back countless generations and a spiritual connection to the land that transcended any government's claim to authority. Even the federal agents seemed affected by it. their weapons lowering slightly as they found themselves witnessing something beyond their experience or understanding. "Captain," one of the marshals said quietly, "maybe we should reconsider our position here. This is getting complicated in ways we weren't prepared for." Ross was clearly struggling with the situation. His orders had been specific: apprehend Jedediah Cole and confiscate the bear. But those orders hadn't anticipated the involvement of tribal authorities or the legal complexities of operating on treaty-protected lands without proper jurisdiction. Thomas Crow Feather chose that moment to emerge from his defensive position, walking calmly toward the federal agents with his hands visible but not raised in surrender. His movements carried the dignity of a man who had faced down greater dangers than a few nervous government officials. "Captain Ross," Thomas said respectfully, "I invite you to witness something that will help you understand what you have stumbled into today." Before Ross could respond, Quiet Thunder began moving down the canyon wall with sure-footed grace that defied his massive size. The bear navigated the treacherous stone formations as if he'd been born to this terrain, which in a spiritual sense, he had been. When Quiet Thunder reached the canyon floor, his reunion with Joseph was extraordinary to witness. The bear approached the man who had once been Little Bear, and they greeted each other with the familiarity of family members separated by circumstances beyond their control. Joseph placed his hands on Quiet Thunder's massive head and spoke to him in Lakota, words of welcome and gratitude that needed no translation. "This creature has been away from his people for 8 years, Thomas explained to the federal agents, who were watching in fascination despite their official duties. "He was taken from us by force, kept in captivity, and made to perform for the entertainment of people who couldn't understand his true nature. Today, he comes home to fulfill his role as protector and guide for our people." The spiritual significance of the moment wasn't lost on anyone present, including Captain Ross. Here was a reunion that transcended the boundaries between human and animal, demonstrating a relationship with the natural world that challenged everything the federal agents thought they understood about civilization and wildness. Jed made his decision. He emerged from his concealed position and walked slowly down the canyon wall, his rifle secured across his back in a gesture of peaceful intent. When he reached the canyon floor, he approached Captain Ross directly, man to man. "Captain," Jed said quietly, "I know you're just following orders. But sometimes orders are wrong, and sometimes a man has to choose between following the law and doing what's right." Ross studied Jed's weathered face, noting the changes that the past weeks had wrought in the former bounty hunter. "You're placing me in an impossible position, Cole. I have federal warrants and direct orders from Colonel Whitmore." "Whitmore," Jed said, understanding flashing across his features. "He's behind this. He's still fighting wars that ended years ago, still trying to destroy people who just want to live according to their own beliefs." "My orders are my orders," Ross replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Jed reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the tarnished badge that had defined his identity for 30 years. Without ceremony, he placed it on a flat rock between himself and Captain Ross. "Then arrest me," Jed said simply. "I'm surrendering myself to federal authority, but the bear stays with his people, where he belongs." The gesture carried weight that everyone present understood. Jed was choosing to sacrifice his freedom to ensure Quiet Thunder's safety, demonstrating the same kind of selfless courage that had led him to save a drowning boy decades earlier. Joseph Crow Feather stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of both personal gratitude and political office. "Captain Ross, I formally request that you allow our guest to remain with us under tribal protection. As an elected representative of a sovereign nation with treaty rights, I guarantee his safety and his peaceful intentions." The request was unprecedented, but it offered Ross a way out of an increasingly complicated situation. By recognizing tribal sovereignty, and allowing the matter to be resolved through diplomatic channels, he could avoid the political fallout that would result from a violent confrontation on treaty-protected lands. As Ross weighed his options, quiet. Thunder moved to stand beside Jed, the bear's massive presence somehow both protective and supportive. The gesture was unmistakable. Whatever happened next, man and bear would face it together. The silence stretched for long moments, broken only by the wind through the canyon walls and the distant sound of water running over stone. Then, Captain. Ross stepped forward and picked up Jed's badge, studying the worn metal for several seconds, before looking up to meet the former bounty hunter's eyes. "Jedediah Cole," Ross said formally, "by the authority vested in me by the United States government, I'm placing you under house arrest in the custody of the Pine Ridge Tribal Council, pending a full investigation of the circumstances surrounding this case. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but offered everyone a way to avoid immediate catastrophe. Jed would remain with the tribal community. Quiet Thunder would stay with his people, and the federal government would have time to develop policies for dealing with situations that their bureaucrats had never anticipated." As the federal agents departed the canyon, their voices carrying discussions of reports that would be difficult to write and explanations that would be even harder to provide, Jed found himself surrounded by people who had welcomed him not as a fugitive, but as family. Returning home, the circle that had begun with a drowning boy and a courageous rescue 37 years earlier was finally complete. 6 months had passed since that transformative day in the canyon, and the autumn wind carried the scent of sage and sweetgrass across the Pine Ridge Reservation as Jed walked the familiar path to the medicine lodge. His hair had grown longer, touched now with more silver than brown, and his face bore the deep lines of a man who had finally learned the difference between existing and truly living. The morning ritual had become sacred to him, checking on Quiet Thunder, participating in the daily ceremonies that marked the passage of seasons, and contributing to the community that had welcomed him not as an outsider, but as family returning home. The federal charges against him had been quietly dropped after a congressional investigation revealed the extent of Colonel Whitmore's unauthorized activities and blatant violations of treaty rights. The colonel himself had been reassigned to a desk job in Washington. His career in frontier operations effectively ended, but none of that mattered as much as what Jed had discovered about himself during these months of living among people who measured success not in dollars accumulated or enemies defeated, but in relationships nurtured and sacred obligations fulfilled. Quiet Thunder emerged from the grove of cottonwoods where he'd made his home, moving with the unhurried grace of a creature completely at peace with his surroundings. The bear had thrived since his return, his coat lustrous and thick as winter approached, his eyes holding depths of contentment that spoke of spiritual completion. The old wounds from his iron collar had healed completely, leaving only faint scars hidden beneath his magnificent fur. "Good morning, old friend," Jed said softly, and Quiet Thunder responded with his familiar chuff of greeting, moving close enough to allow Jed to rest his hand against the bear's massive shoulder. The relationship between them had evolved into something beyond what either man or animal had experienced before. They were companions in the truest sense, bound together by shared experience and mutual respect, rather than dominance or dependence. Quiet Thunder remained wild, free to wander the reservation lands as he chose, but he invariably returned to spend time with the man who had given him back his freedom. Joseph Crow Feather approached along the path from the tribal council offices, carrying the satisfied expression of someone who had just received good news. Over the past months, he and Jed had developed a friendship that honored both their shared childhood experience and their current partnership in various community projects. "The letter from Washington came through this morning," Joseph announced, holding up an official document. "The Department of Interior has officially recognized Quiet Thunder as a protected cultural and spiritual resource of the Lakota people. No federal agency can interfere with his care or custody without formal tribal consent. The news represented a significant victory, not just for their specific situation, but for the broader principle of tribal sovereignty and the recognition of native spiritual traditions by federal authorities. It had taken months of careful political maneuvering and the involvement of sympathetic congressmen, but the result established precedents that would protect other sacred sites and creatures from government interference. "There's more," Joseph continued, his smile widening. "They're also establishing a fund to support traditional cultural preservation programs on the reservation. Your story, the way you brought Quiet Thunder home, has become something of a symbol for people in Washington who want to see more cooperation between federal and tribal governments." Jed felt a complex mixture of pride and humility at this news. The idea that his impulsive decision to buy a bear at auction could have far-reaching political consequences still seemed surreal, but he was learning to accept that sometimes individual actions could ripple outward in ways that changed the world. Thomas Crowfeather joined them, moving with the careful steps of a man whose age was beginning to show, but whose spirit remained undiminished. The old medicine man had become Jed's teacher in many ways, sharing not just practical knowledge about living in harmony with the natural world, but deeper wisdom about finding purpose beyond personal ambition. The children from the boarding school will be arriving this afternoon for the ceremony, Thomas announced. It will be their first time participating in traditional healing rituals since the government allowed us to resume cultural education programs. The ceremony was another breakthrough, a healing ritual centered around Quiet Thunder's presence that would help children who had been separated from their families and cultural traditions begin to reconnect with their heritage. The bear's role as a bridge between the natural and human worlds made him uniquely suited to help young people understand their place in the larger web of relationships that defined Lakota spirituality. "I've been thinking about something," Jed said as they walked together toward the ceremonial grounds, "about what comes next for me. The federal oversight period ends in 2 months, and technically I'll be free to leave the reservation if I choose." Both Joseph and Thomas looked at him with expressions of concern, mixed with understanding. They'd known this moment would come. The time when Jed would have to decide whether his commitment to their community was temporary or permanent. "What does your heart tell you?" Thomas asked quietly. Jed was quiet for a long moment, watching Quiet Thunder lumber along beside them with the patient dignity that had first captured his attention at that dusty auction in Deadwood Gulch. So much had changed since that evening. Not just in his circumstances, but in his fundamental understanding of what it meant to be alive and purposeful. "For 30 years, I defined myself by what I did for money," he said finally. "I was a bounty hunter, a man who caught other men for profit. I thought that's all I was, that's all I'd ever be." He paused, his hand moving unconsciously to touch the medicine bundle that now hung around his neck. "But these past months have taught me that identity isn't about what you do for a living. It's about what you do for love." He gestured toward Quiet Thunder, who had stopped to investigate something interesting among the fallen leaves. "That bear didn't need me to be a famous tracker or a skilled gunfighter. He needed me to be someone willing to honor a sacred obligation, even when it meant giving up everything else I thought I valued." Joseph and Thomas exchanged glances, recognizing the profound transformation that had taken place in their friend over these months of healing and discovery. "I want to stay," Jed continued, "not as a guest or a protected person under federal custody, but as a member of this community. I want to help with the cultural preservation programs, work with the children from the boarding schools, and continue learning from Thomas about the old ways of seeing the world." Thomas placed a weathered hand on Jed's shoulder, his eyes bright with approval and affection. "You were always meant to be here," the old medicine man said. "The spirits prepared this path for you long before you were born. You're not choosing to stay, you're choosing to become who you were always supposed to be." As they reached the Ceremonial grounds, where community members were already gathering for the afternoon's healing ritual, Jed felt a profound sense of completion wash over him. The restless searching that had driven him for decades had finally ended, replaced by the deep satisfaction that came from knowing his place in the world and understanding his true purpose. Quiet thunder settled himself near the center of the ceremonial circle, his massive presence somehow both commanding and comforting. Children began arriving with their teachers, many of them seeing a bear this close for the first time in their young lives. Their initial fear quickly transformed into wonder as they witnessed the gentle interaction between the great creature and the white-haired man who had become his companion and protector. As the ceremony began, and the voices of his adopted people rose in ancient songs of healing and renewal, Jed understood that this was what redemption looked like. Not a dramatic moment of forgiveness or absolution, but the quiet daily choice to serve something larger than himself, to honor relationships that transcended the boundaries of species and culture, and to help heal wounds that had been festering for generations. The boy who had saved a drowning child 37 years earlier had finally grown into the man he was meant to become. And in a world that often seemed defined by division and misunderstanding, that transformation offered hope that perhaps other circles of healing might also find their way to completion. Sometimes a single moment really could change everything. You thought you knew about yourself. Sometimes an old cowboy and a sacred bear could find their way home together, carrying with them the possibility that redemption was always available to those brave enough to reach for it.